No matter how much we think we know about the Black Death, one uncomfortable fact remains. The deeper historians dig, the more contradictions they find. How did a plague that supposedly began in Central Asia suddenly explode through Europe with such unnatural speed, faster than armies, faster than caravans, sometimes even faster than seasonal winds? Why did certain cities collapse within days while others mysteriously remained untouched? And why do medieval records describe symptoms that don't always match the modern explanation of bubonic plague? Some chronicles talk about merchants bringing the disease. Others claim ships arriving with dead sailors. And then there are the strangest reports, the ones describing deliberate poisoning. Strange powders thrown into wells, or enemy forces catapulting infected corpses over walls. Were these just medieval rumors? Or fragments of a truth we ignored? These contradictions force us to ask a deeper question. Was the Black Death purely a natural pandemic? Or did human actions, accidental or intentional, help spread it faster than nature ever could? In this video, we're going to explore everything: the scientific data, the historical accounts, the political incentives, and the events that made the Black Death far more complicated than the textbook version we learned in school. So let's begin. When we talk about the Black Death, we usually start in 1347, when plague-bearing ships supposedly arrived in Sicily. But the Ripoli Chronicle from Florence mentions strange deaths months before. Meanwhile, Persian scholar Ibn al-Ward wrote that the plague had already devastated the lands of the Tatars, spreading with terrifying speed. And even earlier, Chinese court records in the Yuan dynasty mention mysterious mortalities. In 1331, almost 16 years before Europe noticed anything. This long, uneven timeline already hints at something unusual. Bubonic plague, transmitted primarily by fleas on rodents, doesn't normally jump continents with such coordination. Modern epidemiology tells us it spreads in waves, slowly expanding its range. But the Black Death seemed to appear in multiple distant regions almost simultaneously. Was this because of wider trade, climate shifts, or something else entirely? Now let us take an example historians often ignore. The Mongol siege of Kaffa in 1346, it's one of the most controversial episodes in plague history. According to the Italian notary Gabriele de' Musi, the Mongols, overwhelmed by disease, hurled infected corpses into the city as a desperate act of war. Was this the first recorded incident of intentional biological spread? Some historians say yes. Others argue de' Musi never witnessed it personally and relied on second-hand stories. But even if exaggerated, it shows that people in the 1300s already believed human actions were contributing to the plague's spread. The Black Death's symptoms also vary in historical descriptions. Buboes, necrosis, vomiting blood, these match bubonic plague. But then there are accounts of people dying within hours, entire families collapsing overnight, which aligns more with pneumonic plague, the airborne variant. Pneumonic plague can spread through breath, not fleas. If both forms circulated together, it could explain the rapid, devastating mortality rates. But it also raises another question. How did these variants travel long distances so quickly? Fleas don't migrate across seas. Airborne pathogens don't respect borders. Something seems inconsistent. Let's look at the trade routes. The Silk Road was not just a path for merchants. It was a pipeline of movement goods, soldiers, pilgrims, animals, and diseases. But the 14th century was also a time of intense conflict and empire-wide mobility. The Mongols moved troops across thousands of kilometers with incredible speed. When armies march, diseases follow. It is not hard to imagine how infected rodents or soldiers could carry the pathogen across vast regions faster than normal ecological cycles. However, some researchers propose a different angle altogether. For example, scholars from Oslo and Bergen argue that the rapid spread wasn't due to rats at all, but to human lice and fleas, something people carried on their bodies. If true, then human movement, trade caravans, army marches, refugee flows was the real engine of the pandemic. Then comes the most controversial theory: European ecological disruption. During the 14th century, Europe underwent climatic changes known as the Little Ice Age. Farms failed, grain stores emptied, people grew weak. But rodents, especially black rats, thrived in overcrowded, poorly maintained cities. Some researchers suggest that famine, debt, and political instability worsened everything. So even if the initial outbreak was natural, the acceleration was human-made through mismanagement, poor living conditions, and political negligence. But the question remains, was there actual intentional spreading? Let's examine a European example. During the height of the plague, Jewish communities across Germany, Switzerland, and France were accused of poisoning wells. Modern historians overwhelmingly reject this as medieval scapegoating. Yet these false accusations tell us something important. People at the time believed that human agency could spread disease. The idea wasn't foreign to them. More interesting are reports from Genoa and Venice. Ships arriving from the east were sometimes burned entirely, not just quarantined, as if officials feared something beyond natural contagion. Why such drastic measures? Medieval leaders rarely acted without some form of intelligence or fear. Even if they didn't fully understand microbiology, they sensed that human movement was playing a role in propagating the plague. And then we have the odd case of cities that defied the pattern. Milan, for instance, famously walled up infected houses instead of allowing mass movement. As a result, Milan suffered significantly fewer deaths than neighboring regions. If plague spread naturally in all directions equally, such drastic differences wouldn't exist. As the plague tore across continents, something unexpected happened. While ordinary people fled in terror, rulers and elites often made decisions that intentionally or not accelerated the disaster. Take the case of Edward III of England. Instead of shutting down trade, he initially encouraged the continued flow of goods to maintain wartime revenue. Chroniclers like the Westminster Chronicle mention that infected ships still entered ports long after warnings were issued. Venice and Genoa, too, struggled between economic survival and public health. Every delay, every hesitation, every decision to prioritize commerce over containment turned the plague into a continental catastrophe. If the disease was a spark of nature, human choices poured fuel on it. But there's a deeper question. Were these choices purely negligent, or did some groups subtly use the chaos to their advantage? During the plague, land ownership shifted dramatically. When peasants died in massive numbers, feudal lords suddenly discovered labor scarcity. This weakened the feudal order and empowered surviving workers, who demanded higher wages and rights. England's Ordinance of Labourers in 1349 was an aggressive attempt to freeze wages and control. Labor, an early example of governments trying to manage post-pandemic socio-economic shifts. Could some elites have seen the plague as an opportunity to reshape society? Not intentionally release it, of course, but to exploit its impacts? Modern historians like Christopher Dyer note that some elites gained wealth and land during the plague years, consolidating power through inheritance collapses. Slaughter on a societal scale creates winners as well as victims. Now, let's revisit the biological side. There is a fascinating scientific debate about whether the medieval plague originated from multiple independent reservoirs rather than one single outbreak. Genetic studies of Yersinia pestis, the plague bacterium, show numerous strains emerging around the same time. This suggests that the Black Death wasn't one event, but a series of overlapping outbreaks triggered by environmental shocks. Climate records from tree rings show sudden temperature drops in the 1330s that disrupted rodent populations in Central Asia. When their ecosystems collapsed, infected fleas sought new hosts. This explains the initial spark. But again, natural origins don't contradict human contribution. In fact, they highlight how human networks carried the pathogen further than nature ever could. Let's return to Europe. Something strange happens when we study city records. Mortality rates didn't always match population density. Some overcrowded towns survived relatively lightly, while rural areas saw disproportionate losses. Why? Historians like Ol Benedicto argue that local human behavior shaped outcomes far more than environmental factors. Cities that quarantined households, burned contaminated belongings, or restricted travel, primitive but effective measures reduced the spread. Other cities that panicked, fled, or concealed outbreaks suffered worse. These patterns don't match a disease spreading purely through rodents. They align with human-driven transmission, especially through close contact or movement. Even chroniclers notice these inconsistencies. Giovanni Boccaccio, in the Decameron, describes people dropping dead without contact, suggesting airborne transmission. But the Chronicle Angli reports outbreaks that lingered in some port towns for months but skipped inland villages entirely, something natural fleas would unlikely cause. These contradictions push us toward a more complex conclusion. The Black Death was not a single plague, but a combination of epidemics whose spread depended heavily on human environments and actions. Now comes the part most people never hear about: strategic exploitation. During the mid-14th century, wars didn't stop because of plague, they shifted. The Hundred Years' War saw pauses but also sudden offensives when one side believed the other was weakened. Armies marched through infected zones, carrying disease with them. French villages recorded that English troops left death where they passed. But this wasn't necessarily intentional biological warfare, it was simply the reality of medieval movement. Still, the effect was the same. Human conflict amplified the pandemic. Then there is the troubling case of the Tartars at Kaffa. Even if Gabriel de Mussy exaggerated the corpse-flinging incident, multiple independent sources confirm that plague-ridden Mongol armies retreated, leaving infected rats and fleas behind. Whether deliberate or accidental, warfare became a vector. This suggests a middle ground. Not man-made in the sense of laboratory creation, impossible in the 14th century, but man-amplified, where military actions and decisions facilitated spread. Let's consider another overlooked factor: misinformation and rumor. In many cities, fear led to chaotic migrations. Thousands fled from towns at the first sign of disease. Ironically, this spread plague faster. Jewish communities were massacred under accusations of causing the plague. This violence drove refugees across borders, carrying pathogens. Again, human behavior, not bacterial mutation, accelerated transmission. But the final and most revealing evidence comes from what happened after the initial wave. The plague didn't disappear. It returned every decade or two for centuries. Why? Modern scholars now believe that Europe accidentally created man-made reservoirs of Yersinia pestis. Poor sanitation, overcrowded urban housing, grain storage systems, and the explosion of trade routes allowed the bacterium to cycle endlessly. By the 1400s, Europe had unknowingly built the perfect biological engine for plague recurrence. This is why outbreaks lasted until the 18th century, long after conditions in Asia stabilized. So was the Black Death natural or man-made? The answer is not a simple yes or no. It began as a natural outbreak, no question. But once it entered human societies, everything that followed was shaped, accelerated, and magnified by human decisions. Trade routes carried it, armies transported it. Political rivalries concealed it. Refugees fled with it. Leaders mismanaged it. Social collapse amplified it. Europe, not nature, turned an outbreak into an apocalypse. Think of it like fire. Nature strikes the match, but humans determine whether the flame dies quietly or becomes a continent-wide inferno. By the time the Black Death faded, it had killed up to 200 million people. It reshaped populations, economies, religions, and empires. But it also revealed a chilling truth, one we still struggle with today. A natural disease can become a global catastrophe not because of its origin, but because of how humans respond to it. And that is the hidden side of the Black Death, less a mystery of nature, and more a mirror held up to humanity's choices.